Episode 35, Sabrina Moon, CEO of the Problem Solving Institute.
The way that I would show up in the places that I was leading was like a hammer. In fact, I earned that nickname.
I'm Mark Graben. This is My Favorite Mistake. In this podcast, you'll hear business leaders and other really interesting people talking about their favorite mistakes. Because we all make mistakes. But what matters is learning from our mistakes instead of repeating them over and over again. So this is the place for honest reflection and conversation, personal growth, and professional success. Visit our website at myfavoritemistakepodcast.com. And now, on with the show. Well, hi, welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graben. We're joined today by Sabrina Moon. She is the founder and CEO of the Problem Solving Institute. Like me, she's an engineer, unlike me, and I think this is really cool. She's a certified Dare to Lead facilitator, and that's based off of the work of Brené Brown. Is that right?
Yes, it is. Glad to be here.
Yeah, well, thank you for being here, and really looking forward to your story and the conversation that we're going to have afterwards, Sabrina. So I guess we'll jump right in. What would you say is your favorite mistake?
So when I thought about this question, the list was long, but the shortest answer is using shame. Using shame as a tool in my leadership roles in corporate America in the midst of business transformation or, and then some. So using shame as a tool.
So is there a particular story that comes to mind that kind of helps illustrate situation where, let's say, maybe something went wrong? How did you react as a leader where shame was part of it?
This is, there's lots of stories and lots of instances. And I'm going to share that before we came into this space, I listened to Jamie Parker's interview with you, which was awesome. I need to take her for virtual coffee. She's my people. So listening to her talk about a recovering command and control leader, like immediately I was like, yes, aren't we all in some ways, especially if, we've been leading in lean spaces or in manufacturing spaces for sure.
Right.
So when I think about command and control, that's definitely how I was taught to lead. And when I think about that, I was taught by leaders and mentors who absolutely were passing on the baton to me and doing the best that they can. Mm-hmm. So as I tell these stories, and this story in particular, it'll be hard for sure, but the only way that we can really understand what I mean by using shame is to just go there.
Yeah.
So oftentimes when I think about command and control, it was for me usually an intolerance for connecting with people and an intolerance for vulnerability in general. So the way that I would show up in the places that I was leading was like a hammer. In fact, I earned that nickname, Hammer. Yeah. And, that you and I share General Motors in common. I don't know if you knew that. Okay.
Yes, I knew that. I don't have to that. So when you say you were taught that, that resonates with me, because if I wasn't careful, that's what I was going to be taught. And I rebelled against that, kind of from the beginning. But, there's no shame in following what examples being set for you in an organization.
Exactly. So, and that's the thing, like what we're being taught as leaders, that was leadership at the time. And we're learning a lot of new information now about emotions, and shame is an emotion. But we're learning a lot about that now and how it shows up in our workplaces and how it impacts our leadership skills. And we're also learning, this is new, like self-awareness skills. They are lacking in our leadership in our organizations. And we just don't know what we don't know.
Yeah. So,
reflecting back a little bit on Jamie's story, and what I really appreciated in her story was the self-awareness piece. Mm-hmm. So as she talks through how a mentor had said to her, "How's that working for you?" And she was like, oh my gosh, I have to reflect back on how this is working for me. I applaud that skill in being able to be curious. So when I think about my missteps in using shame, specifically, I think about a business transformation that I was leading in a small community, and it was really to save this organization from bankruptcy. The plant was facing bankruptcy. And I remember working 16 hours a day. I remember when I first walked into this plant, there were no stripes on the aisleway to know where you could walk or not be. So like when you walked in, you didn't know if you were going to get nailed by a fork truck or not.
Yeah.
So in the midst of that transformation, there was a lot of stress, a lot of pressure, a lot of fear about people losing their jobs. And there were about 3 of us who had the skills, some that we learned from General Motors, but some elsewhere, to be able to transform this plant. And I would stand frequently out at the final line, and I would have I think I used my cell phone at the time to capture cycle time. And we just could not get the rate we needed. We couldn't get finished goods out the door in the time that we needed. And I would use shame and the fear of shame to keep those people in line. And what I mean by that is I would say things like, "What is wrong with you? You suck. You're an idiot." Or things like, "Suck it up. Here's what you need to be producing at the end of the line, and you're not. This has to be your fault because every time I take some, times on the line, this has nothing to do with the equipment. It has everything to do with you." When I reflect back about those statements, those are not proud moments. Those are moments of me using shame in a way that was motivating that team temporarily, but it was also corroding trust and creating an environment where people felt the need to, come out swinging toward me.
Right.
So, yeah. And in that specific example, I didn't know what I didn't know, though, Mark. Like, I thought that was leadership because I was taught to use that type of language.
Right. And that's why, you might feel bad about it, but I won't shame you individually, again, for having modeled what was being taught to you explicitly and through example, I'm sure, in that environment.
Right. For sure. So even when we reflect back on your career, and if we were to think of those moments when shame was being used in the industries that you were leading, it was standardized and normal.
It was commonplace. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was a reflection of leadership at the time. Okay. So now that when we think about that story, and it took me some time to look back and do my own type of continuous improvement, if you will, and my own leadership transformation. I had no idea, though, that the reason I was behaving in that way, yes, I thought it was because of how I was taught, but honestly, I didn't understand that I was in shame, hence the reason I was using shame. So let me unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so when we say the word shame, it is considered the primitive master emotion that we all experience, but none of us want to talk about it. And when we think about Brene Brown and her research, she's really been the go-to person regarding emotions and emotional literacy for leaders. And she really helps us understand vulnerability and shame. And shame is that emotion essentially that we feel when we feel something about us is inherently flawed, broken, or unworthy of belonging. And it shows up in our workplaces, something fierce, because people are there. So when we think about that emotion and what it means for us, we have to understand how we behave when we're in that emotion. And this is where self-awareness skills come in. So when I think about shame, there are 3 patterned ways that we behave when we're hooked by something like shame or really any tough emotion. We either use shame against people, so we become defensive, or we come out emotionally swinging.
Right.
Or we go into people-pleasing behavior. So when we're in shame, then we seek to make sure everybody's taken care of. And lastly, we withdraw and hide out from people when we're in shame. We disappear.
Right.
So when I said, I was using shame against this team, it was because I was in shame. That was absolutely true. That was a point in my life where I was struggling with the amount of hours I was working and also struggling to take care of a sick mom with cancer. And when I would come into work, I would come in so ticked off because we still hadn't made any progress. We were still losing money. People's jobs were still going to disappear. And I didn't know how to do that differently. Sorry, right. My doorbell is ringing. That's like the worst time.
It's not really a mistake. That just happens. That's fine.
But the doorbell, yeah, like who's here? COVID times. Nobody's coming.
No, that's fine.
To visit. So yeah, I would frequently come into that plant frustrated because we hadn't made any progress, and the changes we had committed to implementing the day before weren't implemented. So I was deeply feeling shame, and I would offload my shame and my crap onto other people. So it became really easy for me to tell people that they were idiots and that no matter what they did, it wasn't going to be,
Right.
So yeah, it was using shame to fight shame was my common go-to in the workplace. So
yeah. Well, I mean, that totally reminds me of, back when I was at General Motors. So I worked there right out of college. It was 95 to 97. Very traditional command and control leadership. There were a couple of them that I would really, the word bully comes to mind very quickly. Yeah. And, the number 2 leader at our plant, was notorious. Every single day, we would do this production review meeting between first shift and second shift. And we have these kind of internal consultants that have been hired from Toyota suppliers, and one was from Nissan. And they said, well, you need to track your hourly production, and we'll do this daily review. Well, you and I would now realize, Sabrina, the intent of a meeting like that is to just give visibility to where the issues are and to direct resources and to do problem solving in a constructive way. Well, that meeting became, that data told this guy, Bob, basically who he needed to yell and scream at the most, which was not the intent of what any of this data or this review was supposed to be. And as a couple of us, we would have like these little side wagering pools for $1 of like, which word is Bob going to say first? And I think this is shaming language. There would be, he was bullying, and there would be cursing. It would be, calling people out in front of others. But the wager would always be, which word is Bob going to use first? Urgency or intensity? Because those were the 2 things in Bob's mind that was lacking. Like clearly that department or the plant as a whole was struggling only because people didn't care enough or they didn't try hard enough. And that was just ridiculous.
Yeah, it is ridiculous because, do we honestly think for a minute? So when we think back about our careers, and you've talked to a lot of leaders, you've seen a lot of things. When we think back about our careers, do we honestly think that people got up that morning saying, you know what, I'm going to completely screw everything up that I can today. Yeah. And I want to make sure that I let Mark and Sabrina down as much as I can because I suck. Yeah. I mean, no, like people are not wired like that. Right. So, the lacking self-awareness that we bump into sometimes, a lot of our really yucky, ineffective leadership is absolutely happening outside of our self-awareness. Mm-hmm. So, it is up to us to dig in and get curious. And that's the hard part. That's the part that requires vulnerability to look within, to be able to say, okay, what do I own in this so that I can understand how I show up differently?
Right.
So with that said, I remember getting to that point of having to ask for feedback about how I was showing up. Mm-hmm. And that was tough.
Asking, who are you asking for feedback? Your employees or?
Yeah, no, well, yes, eventually got to the point, but I was asking a leader that I respected, like, okay. I feel like I keep bumping into this thing that I don't know what it is. And I want to do this differently. I'm not really sure how. And I remember his feedback at the time was, you know what, Sabrina, you come at people assuming that they are doing their worst, assuming that they are trying to intentionally screw some things up. And it was like, I don't want to come at people at all. That's not who I am. Yeah. So, how do I do this differently? And that started the transformation, a 5-year transformation process of unpacking shame, mm-hmm. How it showed up for me, how I could learn to do things differently. How could I approach anyone, regardless if it was a business transformation, from a place of, I believe they're doing the best that they can, and hold them accountable at the same time.
Right.
So that's where understanding shame and shame resilience skills really kind of saved my professional career. Do I still screw things up? I mean, yes.
Sure.
Yeah, I learn something every day.
Well, if something's become a habit, that can be really hard to break.
For sure. For sure. Because you know what? We have seen results when we use shame.
Or at least in the short term.
For sure.
I was going to ask earlier, like when you said, well, it was motivating. Like, was it I mean, was it really motivating? Or if it was, is it just not sustainable?
Yeah, it's definitely, so we use shame and the fear of shame to motivate, but I think in an unhealthy way. It's, for me, I would utilize shame because it was the last tool in my toolbox. And I was desperate. Like, I needed results. I didn't want to wait. And I knew if I would talk to people using shaming language, they would move. They would physically move and get things done. So in my mind, I made the decision that it was motivating.
Yeah.
At what cost, though? When I started seeing that team members did not trust me, and there was a lot of what we call back channeling happening as a result, which was, talking about each other and not to each other.
Right.
So we couldn't really do any effective problem solving because there wasn't any trust. And then you started seeing apathy set in, and exhaustion and all the other things that come as a result.
Sure.
So somebody has to go first to change that, and it's not them.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask, you mentioned earlier saying a lot of times or too often leaders are not self-aware. I was going to ask you, what was the moment where you realized like something clicked and like, okay, this is not effective? Was it that, I think you already alluded to it. Was it that feedback? And if so, maybe to elaborate on that. I mean, there's risk that moment didn't happen. Like, how would your career have progressed differently without that?
Great question. When I think about the what ifs, I was promoted often and quickly in the roles that I was in. And, there's a chance I could have been promoted more, but there was definitely, I can guarantee that I would have not, promoted from within. I wouldn't have felt good about me because there was often that feeling of something isn't right. And I feel like I'm the common denominator. So I was feeling worse and worse and worse as I was earning more and more and more and getting bigger titles and responsibilities. So with that said, I think had I not learned that, things would have been drastically different. Probably with some walking papers along the way. And I'm grateful that I had that moment of help me understand, what is it within me that's not working well. And then once I got the courage and the practice to step into those types of conversations and get more and more feedback, I started getting better at it. And then I really started looking within.
What I hear you saying is that there was, in different words, like sort of just this discomfort of like, well, this, like, and trying to unpack and figure out what was causing the discomfort, which I guess led to the request for feedback, and then realizing, correct me if I'm wrong, what I hear you saying is, recognizing a gap between how I'm acting or who I'm being at work versus who I am or who I want to be, that built up and led to you asking for that feedback. I guess it wasn't just a chance occurrence.
Yeah, I absolutely felt there was a huge gap between who I was and how I was leading.
Yeah.
And some of the messages and expectations around who I needed to be as a leader. I often struggled with how kind and how much I should care about the people I was leading. Like, should I actually care how well they're doing? should I understand what's happening in their lives, or should I just drop the hammer on them? That there was a constant struggle between the two. And I was misfiring and misaligned on a regular basis, that I would go home and I could just feel it.
Yeah.
And then I would never stop talking about work and how frustrating it was and how people wouldn't work with me in ways that I had hoped. So it was a golden opportunity for self-discovery.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of gold in that failure.
Yeah. Well, but it's good you took advantage of that opportunity for self-discovery. And it sounds like when you were getting that feedback, you weren't in denial about it, but you realized, yeah, that's happening and that can change.
Yeah. And I'm appreciative of the person who gave me feedback, because they didn't come at me from a place of, you suck, you're an idiot. So they didn't use shame on me. They were able to step into, a place of compassion and empathy and say, hey, you might want to look at this, and I'll support you along the way for you to look at it. And then, at that point, it really started to unfold. And then I was able to dive deeper into my own self-awareness skills and how I was showing up, and asking people often, like, how was that for you? Where can I improve?
Right.
Yeah.
Nice.
It's the crux of what we do now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what we do now. And, it's interesting to look back and think about our own mistakes and growth and development. I just want to come back. You talked earlier, offloading the shame, and kind of quick story back at you. Again, I'm thinking of old Bob, and there's this, it's kind of a Chicago Saturday Night Live kind of accent that he had, kind of like one of the super fans. And I remember when I was getting ready to get out of there and go to grad school, I felt a little bit more brave. But basically, like another engineer and I were in Bob's office, and he was putting on a show. He intentionally turned around, dialed the phone on the credenza behind him, got it on speakerphone, and just cursed and yelled and screamed at one of the production area managers that I supported as an engineer. And it was just one direction yelling, and poor Todd was just, but just stamp, Bob was just laying into him. So Bob got off the phone, and I asked him some form of that help me understand question, like help me understand what was going on there. Well, how was that helpful? I don't remember the exact words, but I kind of challenged him, like, so what's going on here? And then he basically went on to explain what you described as offloading the shame. He said basically, well, I yell at Todd because my boss called and yelled at me, and his boss called and yelled at him. He basically traced it up and blamed the General Motors board of directors. I kid you not.
Yeah.
He was basically saying, like, that's just the culture here. And okay, fair enough. I don't know how much tension he felt, because I almost heard him saying, well, this is what I'm expected to do, which is different than just saying, oh yeah. I mean, he probably wasn't going to say, I love being a bleep hole, but I'd be curious, if I could go back in time and ask him, well, how comfortable does that behavior make you feel? That might have been pushing it a bit too far. I might have gotten thrown out.
Yes. And I think back about that too, Mark. I think back about the moments even when my boss or someone had approached me with shaming language, because, it happened a lot. And, I didn't have the skills then to not only walk myself through, I didn't have resilient skills to be able to understand what I was up against, because I was not paid to feel at work. I was not paid to talk about emotions. I was paid to get it done at all costs. Yep. I was paid to think and do, not to feel.
Yeah.
Well, this was the hard lesson. Like, I needed to learn how emotions were impacting my work. So did my bosses. But it wasn't up to me to carry my boss's stuff or to deal with their emotions. It was up to me, though, to take care of me and then lean into the hard conversation if and when it warranted itself, which I usually never did it, not with senior leaders. Like, if something was offloaded my way, it was my job to be the people pleaser at all costs. Yeah. Like, how can I make sure you're okay? And then I would drop the hammer and offload my shame, onto the teams I was leading.
Right.
And even in class 1 railroading, that 8 years of that work, that was pretty commonplace too. And it got results. But the offloading, as I've learned, is really what we do when we blame and shame when we are feeling uncomfortable and we're feeling pain. And when we don't have kind of an emotional language, then it's just easy behaviorally to cause pain for other people versus healing our own and dealing with it. But, if I were to reverse time, I would love to be able to say exactly to your point to my bosses and to my leaders, hey, what's happening for you right now? Like, are you all right? Because it doesn't seem like you're all right. And I'm not sure that this is going to be effective. Like, what can I do right now as opposed to, taking the lash and you just need a break?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I didn't have those skills then. But yeah, we have them now. I mean, we're getting better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and one other thing, just an aside, another thought that came to mind, we're talking about these manufacturing environments, and this is more of, somehow human dynamics. And maybe this is what you learn through, your study of Brene Brown's work, which I only have the most superficial knowledge of myself. So, but in healthcare, this human behavior, it's so common, this shaming tendency. Like, people all throughout healthcare, they say, oh, right, yeah, naming, blaming, and shaming.
Yep.
That's the norm. It's and it's so dysfunctional and so harmful in so many ways. It ends up being harmful to patients. It harms the careers of people working in that environment. And that's pre-COVID.
Right. And I would ask, has it gotten worse since COVID? I mean, have you seen it getting even worse?
Well, because I haven't traveled for work in 8 months. I don't have quite the insights firsthand that I had when I was traveling. But I mean, there's no shortage of news reports within industry news and even general news publications about how bad the burnout is in healthcare, and how they've been overwhelmed and exhausted. And you hear stories of people not being able to take a day off, for how many weeks or months, and pulling double shifts because colleagues are quarantined. I can't imagine it. I mean, I can't imagine it's gotten better, but I think there are positive examples where the culture has been positive to begin with, and people are engaged, and it's less of that top-down command and control style. I imagine the health systems that have had that more participatory culture are doing better, and I've heard reports of that, which is good.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I've been following your work for 4 years maybe now, and I'll never forget a conversation you and I had I think on LinkedIn at some point. That's just really given me a lot of respect for what you do and how you're leading. And I'm going to paraphrase this. You may or may not remember it, but I remember thinking we were talking about a lean transformation or something along the lines. And I remember you making a statement publicly that people are complex, that, it's not just so simple that we can apply a label on people. And I think your words were, I'm a chatty engineer, or I'm a
chatty introvert.
Oh, a chatty introvert, or like a social, I don't know. You gave me some dichotomies about, people. And I don't know, it gave me a lot of respect for you because it helped me really start practicing, a behavior where I'm committed to being a learner and getting it right versus being a knower and being right. And, when we're under a lot of stress, including a pandemic, we're potentially on our worst behaviors. So, sometimes we just don't know about people. We have to be willing to extend them some grace and then recognize when we need our own breaks. And you've been an example of that in our social media community, just so you know that.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I mean, you use that word grace. That's something I've tried to be better at during the pandemic. Small example, Starbucks gets your drink wrong.
Yes.
Stuff like that, where I'm not going to yell. It's not me to yell and curse and scream, but It might be a matter of tone or look on my face where I let it be known that I'm upset.
Yeah.
I try not to let stuff like that bother me, because back to that point of like, oh, it's just a simple mistake. They can fix it.
Yeah.
What's the big deal? So I'm trying to be more gracious about situations like that.
Yeah, for sure. And I do think we're all doing the best we can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Sabrina, can you tell us a little bit more about the company that you founded, Problem Solving Institute, and we'll spend a couple of minutes talking about the type of work you do, how people can contact you. But first off, how would you describe the Institute and the work that you do?
So I started my business with the intent of really centering on process improvement and business transformation. So the consulting, it's a consulting business, and the consulting work that I was primarily focused on was that. So business efficiency, operational excellence. And what I kept finding was that people were contacting me for leadership help. So help my team, my frontline workers aren't talking to each other. There's no trust. So I kept being asked for that. And then I recognized that was part of my niche. But then I also recognized that's really the core of what problem solving is, because we can't do any of the transformation work until we have some level of trust and willingness to communicate.
Right.
So the crux of what I do now is a lot of leadership development work, a lot of Dare to Lead work, part of Brene Brown's work, obviously. So I help leaders and organizations develop self-awareness skills and have hard conversations. Mm-hmm. I still do some transformation work in the background.
Yeah. So that self-awareness can be developed. That's a good thing to hear.
It's a skill. It's a teachable skill.
And I mean, imagine that some of those difficult conversations might involve somebody being told they need to be more self-aware, or how often is it someone coming to you saying, I individually need help, versus an organization saying, oh, these people need help?
Occasionally I will have a leader of an organization, kind of point the finger and be like, it's my team. But not a lot. Mm-hmm. Usually leaders that reach out are often willing to discover things about themselves too. So they want to be a part of the process. So, and one of the really big things I'm proud of right now is doing work with law enforcement. So I work heavily with law enforcement leaders, and they're very similar to operations leaders. That's a podcast for later, but there's a lot in common.
In terms of shaming or command and control, I mean, there is quite literally a rank command structure.
Yep. And they're in that 24/7 environment where, they're on. So a lot of hypervigilance, same with ops leaders. So, there's a lot of similarities between those environments and what they do in public service. So there's opportunity for growth for them too. But it's great work.
That's very interesting. Well, great. Well, our guest again has been Sabrina Moon. I want to mention first, before getting URLs and contact info, I was going to mention the episode with Jamie Parker that Sabrina mentioned was episode 8. If you want to go back and find that, you can find it in the podcast feed, or you can go to markgraban.com/mistake8. I also want to mention and give a shout out, because I really enjoyed the conversation you had, Sabrina, with our mutual friend, Paul Critchley, on the New England Lean podcast. So I would encourage you, if you want to hear, a different conversation, touches on some of the same points. But actually, I heard that conversation and reached out to Sabrina and said, let's take a deeper dive into basically the My Favorite Mistake you had brought up in Paul's podcast. So thank you for doing that, Sabrina, and thank you for being open to coming on here and exploring that.
Thanks for the invite and for your leadership, Mark. I appreciate you.
Well, thanks. And before we go, Sabrina, what's your website? How can people find you online?
You can find me. The website is ProblemSI, like Problem Solving Institute, but shortened.com. I'm on LinkedIn pretty heavily. Facebook is another place to reach out and connect.
Great. ProblemSI.com. And again, thank you so much to Sabrina Moon, founder and CEO of the Problem Solving Institute. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. I hope this podcast inspires you to pause and think about your own favorite mistake and how learning from mistakes shapes you personally and professionally. If you're a leader, what can you do to create a culture where it's safe for colleagues to talk openly about mistakes in the spirit of learning? Please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. Our website is myfavoritemistakepodcast.com. See you next time.